Are we live?
Yep.
Cool. Hi, everybody. This is the SIG Auth meeting for August 9th. So today we'll be going over a few things. Specifically, it looks like there's a discussion about a proposal for generating RBAC profiles that will probably take up most of the conversation, I imagine. So just to go through our agenda items, there are a few pull requests of note. The biggest one is probably enabling the short caching of successful tokens. This is opened by Jordan and is meant as a way to alleviate some of the pressures on service accounts authenticating very frequently. When they require a lookup, it's on every single HTTP request, it becomes very heavy load on a high cluster, on a big cluster. So this adds a short cache, and you should look at it if you're sort of interested. One I would like to call out is the EDE node tests. So I do note that this is actually blocked on moving the SIG Auth EDE tests out of or into their own repo, so we can be paged throughout the release. I think that was Jacob Simpson who was opening the PR that is blocking the other one. So Jacob, if you're on the call, it'd be great to see that one move forward a little bit, because it's blocking us adding a whole lot more other auth EDE related tests. Whoa. Another one was the CSR approver is getting some resyncing. This is the CSR approver built into the controller manager, and this addresses a bug that was found that the approver doesn't reevaluate existing CSRs. So if you're using the CSR approver in the controller manager, you might want to take a look at that. Also, another one that was merged is that the node authorizer is now on by default on local up cluster. And so this is another one of these things that will probably be pushing more and more of the cluster up strategies, whether that be actual distribution mechanisms or whatever to be using. So this is a great step forward on that. Are there any other PRs that people want to call out before we move on, or is there anything that people felt we should discuss for the existing ones? Cool. We'll move on to the next item then. So designs of notes. I put together a proposal, a formal proposal for actually a current PR that's out, specifically around adding an API to allow users to get in bulk the set of actions that they can provide. That has some good discussion on it. I don't think that there's a whole lot that we can address, or that we need to address here in this meeting, because I don't see anything super blocked right now. But if there are any comments, anybody's seen that, has any concerns, now would be an awesome time to raise them. Or if anybody is unclear about what that is and would like more clarification. Cool. And then I did want to call out that the OpenStack SIG mailing list. There was a out-of-key authenticator and authorizer sent to that mailing list. These are authenticators and authorizers used these are authenticators and authorizers that use the webhooks built into the API server to drive authentication and authorization. And I think is where we want to see more of the development happen. We want to see more development of out-of-tree things that interact with specific identity providers or policy management systems. So I wanted to call that out as a good one.
And as a note, the authentication provider for kube control that provides the client-side aspect of that for obtaining an OpenStack token merged as well in the past week or so. So if you have a machine that has all the environment variables set to speak to OpenStack, a lot of OpenStack tooling is driven by that. It can actually obtain a token and then present it. And if your server was using this token authenticator authorizer, then kube-control would just work seamlessly for you.
And this was this work on, at least on the plugin side, or the out of tree authenticator, has been done by DIMS. So thanks for that. And there's some good conversation in there in that thread about sort of how people think about out of tree authenticators and authorizers, and there might be some docs we can clean up based off of some of the conversation in that thread. Cool. So any other designs of notes that I missed or didn't see that anybody wants to bring up?
We don't have to talk about it here, but I wanted to mention the Tenor Identity Working Group kicked off this week. So I'll put in a link to the discussion group and the agenda notes from that. If people are interested in that, they can join that working group discussion and follow the agenda. And the meeting was recorded, so I'll put a link to that as well.
All right. Is Tim here to discuss his proposal for generating RBAC profiles?
Yeah, I can just give a little introduction on this. So this is something that came up a few times when talking to customers about some of the new audit logging features that we're launching. And a theme that we kept seeing is customers that wanted to use audit logging in order to help them to create and debug their setting up the proper RBAC rules. And so this kind of spawned this brainstorming session with a few people here at Google, and we wanted to kind of open it up to the whole SIG Auth community of how can we use the data about calls that applications are making to kind of help with this process of creating RBAC profiles. Profile loosely here meaning the whole set of roles and role bindings that apply to a specific application. Yeah, just to go into a few things quickly, it would be pretty trivial at this point to hack something up, and I've been meaning to do this one of these evenings, that just scans through the audit logs that we're generating, looking for a specific service account or whatever you want to give it, and kind of collecting up all of the different API calls that are being made and generating a profile for you. Modulo some stuff like, do you want to only apply this to a namespace or a specific resource or all resources of that type? But some of the issues, sorry, let me bring that back up. One of the issues with actually using the audit logs here is ideally this would be open to the developer of the application and not necessarily something that the cluster admin would need to do for them. And the audit logs are typically going to be more locked down since they could have potentially confidential information in them. And so we were sort of talking about some ways that we could provide the same functionality without opening up access to the entire audit log. And so that's what some of the discussions below are. Yeah, are there any thoughts on this so far?
I really like the idea of audit to allow, and that was something I was actually working on and didn't end up completing. But the idea of audit to allow is a great idea. I think that's really useful. The interesting thing is that to to successfully audit or to be confident that you have kind of exercised most of the API calls or all the API calls, you actually need them to be allowed while you're in the audit phase or the generation phase.
Right.
And so is that something, like you talked about the split between kind of the application developer and the cluster administrator. Would you expect a cluster administrator to let the developer kind of run with essentially unbounded permissions in order to gather the information about what API requests were being made?
Yeah, that's a good question. And kind of similarly, is the cluster admin going to need to, approve the final profile? I think it would depend a lot on the environment. You wouldn't necessarily need to give full root on cluster access to the application. If you have some, pre-existing assumptions about what the application is doing, you could say, constrain it to a certain namespace, or, make a kind of best guess of what is the upper bound of permissions the application needs.
Yeah, that was my thought, is that the most common case would be you start out with admin in a namespace, you let it run, and then you figure out I'm actually only using these 3 resources and I only need read-only on one of them.
Yeah, I like the idea. I think the tricky thing is if you're counting on this to create a role that's tightly scoped, based solely on exercising the application, you're going to miss exceptional cases, which we ran into even with the kubelet or controllers, where if it encounters some error condition, it's going to try to do a get of this other thing and then do a patch of this other thing to recover from that. And so starting with a really permissive role and then seeing what it actually uses and then giving it a tighter role, I think you still need a feedback loop once you have a tighter role to say, hey, this thing got denied and I wasn't expecting it to get denied. I thought it had a role that gave it everything it needed. So whatever the output of this is, I think we still want that feedback loop, and to be able to kind of update, see that has happened, and then fold those back into an update of the role. Basically, audit to allow.
Yeah, I mean, there is a concrete example of this that we hit is when you turn on some admission plugins. As you try to create resources with owner refs, you get denied by admission sometimes on some servers.
Yeah.
I know exactly what it was you were doing.
Yeah, this definitely wouldn't be fully automate, humans never needed to look at RBAC rules again. It would be more of a kind of help you to get started with the initial profile, and then still definitely require some oversight to get it right.
Yeah.
Actually, if you scroll down on the discussion section, one of the questions I had posed was about this dry run mode, which I think is related to what you're just talking about. In this workflow, you start with the very admissive rules, and you use that to collect the data, and then you generate this profile, and then there's this kind of iteration process maybe afterwards. And the question is, do we need a sort of mixed mode where we're still trying to apply the profile, but things that would get blocked make it through? Or can we say just kind of keep it on for longer in the permissive mode, or kind of what that workflow is in terms of updating the profile from there?
So when I was actually working on this, I had done it as just a webhook authorizer that actually ran before RBAC. So everything that this service account did would hit the webhook, and it would say yes, no, or it could log it and then pass it through to RBAC. And then once you thought you were good, you could actually move it behind RBAC, and then anything that RBAC rejected would come through. And so then it would kind of ping you and say, it tried to do a thing and RBAC said no, and that's surprising. So, I mean, obviously, if you're messing around with the API server stuff and restarting the API server, this is more of a test environment. So it's not something you could easily do live. But if you're basing it on audit events, then you could, as long as those are telling you this got denied, this got allowed.
We could always, run both. I don't know if that's crazy. You could run the front running one and then the backup one. And that way you could have some semblance of doing per user dry run mode.
Maybe. We only allow a single webhook today. That would be 2.
Oh, is that true?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the other thing I like about this is it gives us a place to hook kind of best practices in a programmatic way. Like we can document best practices all we want, but if the thing that is kind of dynamically creating a prototype role for you is saying, if you allow update, you should also allow patch. Generally, that's a best practice. If you allow list, you should probably also allow get. Like there's no real reason to not. And if you do a list and you need to do a live check, doing a get might be something it would do. So there's, having a way to kind of guide people to say these groups of things go together. If you need fine-grained permission or fine-grained control, you have it. But if you don't have a strong opinion, these types of permissions usually go together. I like having a place that can kind of make those recommendations.
So can I suggest that we break this problem down a little bit? Because I think that there's 2 parts of it. So number one is making it possible to collect the data necessary to understand where and how RBAC is doing something that you might not expect. And that definitely intersects with the audit logs, but there is that aspect of making those things available to most users, and configuring audit logs right now is more difficult than it probably should be. You can't do that dynamically without sort of mucking with API server flags.
Is that true? I thought you could do that dynamically.
No, not currently.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think
I'm thinking of the future. Sorry.
Yeah. Moira, what were you gonna say, man?
Oh, admission controllers are the only dynamic
configurable
webhook right now.
Okay.
And so right now we have this undocumented but whispered way of actually figuring out where your RBAC rules might be wrong by doing this sort of like, turning on, I'm trying to remember, like essentially you run RBAC, you have it log at like, was it V = 6, and then you run always allow outside of it, and then you look at the sort of the text logs coming out of it, right? Is that documented?
Yes.
Oh, it is documented now. Sweet. Okay.
Right there.
And that's fine if you are if you're managing your API server and you're not in this admin.
Okay. Yeah, no, I'm glad that that's documented because that's super useful. But it's still a little bit like, like you wouldn't necessarily want to do that on a production cluster.
Right. I think the idea is if you're an application developer, you can run local up cluster and do this. Like it's not ideal maybe, and we could definitely do better.
We can't expect that every application developer is going to do a local up cluster or even Minikube, but even setting this in Minikube is going to be difficult, right? Like most users out the gate, they're going to have a cluster that they develop against, and they don't want to be in the management business.
And they're not, and they don't have access to the logs. Like, don't get me wrong. I love the idea of audit to allow type of things and making it easier to do that off of the audit stream, or I think that's great. Because even someone who has access to the logs, turning that into the right roles and bindings is not trivial,
Well, I guess that's what I'm trying to say is that there's 2 parts of it. So number one is actually getting the data in a way that's easy to access, that's structured well, and and you're comfortable actually handing it off based on permissions and roles of admin versus not. And then the second thing is, okay, how do you distill that data into actionable things, right? And I feel like, maybe if we solve the first one first, then we can look at what does it exactly do the second one.
And in Tim's defense, the actual proposal does go into a little bit about, how we might make API servers expose this a little bit more regularly. I imagine that there's some audit backend built into the API server that allows people to view their own audit log, for instance, within a given amount of time or something.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a great idea. I think I'm just trying to sort of wrap my head around how do we start chewing on this, and yeah. So Tim, I mean, is this just something that you were brainstorming, or is this something?
Yeah, this is definitely brainstorm stage
Okay.
right now. I really like that idea of some sort of webhook, or if there was a way that I could run something locally that would, open a communication channel to the cluster and start gathering every call that came through. And then this would give us a way to generate profiles client side, have limit what I'm actually allowed to see in the cluster, not get full audit log access, and also kind of work in the various deployment environments.
Yeah. So one thing I'm thinking about is that, like, could we build? So right now you could have, I'm not an expert on the audit log stuff, unlike you, but could we build something that takes the full fire hose of the audit log, and then based on configuration and policy starts teeing that off in appropriate ways in a decoupled way? So this means that this doesn't require more stuff to be built into the API server. It builds on the stuff that we already have. It can be a standard component, this sort of audit sort of dispatcher that folks install, and then being able to tee that off into different systems or storage or what have you can be configured perhaps on a namespace by namespace basis.
Yeah, the current audit log allows you to provide a webhook to just send all of the audit events, or at least the ones that you haven't filtered out. So that is probably buildable today. I imagine we're going to hit the same sort of issue that a lot of people who want dynamic authenticators or authorizers, that it's not going to be configurable unless you have access to the API server flags.
Well, I think, so the other Tim St. Clair, I'm sorry, Tim, this is freaking confusing. So the other Tim St. Clair at FTO built this event router thing to do something similar for scraping events coming out of Kubernetes, right? It's just, it's a little connector that there it's a pull versus a push type of thing that is a sort of a generic sort of multiplexer. That might be one way. And I'm thinking, like, maybe you could program that multiplexer with CRDs that are on a per namespace basis, so that, like, for your namespace, you could say, I want to actually create a CRD, kind of like an ingress, that actually redirects the audit logs for me to this particular endpoint. And then it would be up to that, that thing to actually figure out what happens if that webhook's not available, et cetera, et cetera. Just trying to break this down into something that's approachable.
Mm-hmm.
So Tim, do you want to send that document to the SIG Auth mailing list for the folks that aren't on the call, just so they're aware of it? You can take a look.
Yeah, sure, I can do that.
Cool.
Awesome. So the only other discussion item that I'd like to bring up, at least, is there was a request to cherry pick one of the OIDC server fixes. This involved Go OIDC, the dependency, not parsing headers correctly. So I was going to open that just as a PR, as a cherry pick, but if somebody has opinions about whether that's appropriate or inappropriate, then it'd be great to hear.
Small, non-disruptive bug fixes seem like the kind of things we should be willing to pick.
Cool. So that's the end for the agenda items that we have documented. Is there any other discussions that people wanted to bring up, or shall we end it early?
Does somebody want to give the TLDR of what was discussed at the working group, since we have some time? I mean, I wasn't able to attend. I'd love to hear a quick summary.
I can do that if you like.
Yeah, that'd be great, Greg. Thanks.
Yeah, so essentially we kind of introduced Clayton. So Clayton came up with some kind of broad goals for the working group about kind of what we think we're doing and what we don't think we're doing. And we talked through that, and also kind of some of the boundaries, like, for example, like we don't want to reinvent authorization. Someone brought up, are we going to do kind of detection and alerting as part of this work? And we said no. so like the scope that at least I'm thinking of is kind of to take the detection and alerting piece, like that we have identities that we can strongly verify, that we know are reliable, that aren't spoofable, that we can write into logs, and then that's the end of the kind of identity piece for detection and alerting, and then you would have to kind of build detection and alerting off that kind of information. And we also don't want to, bring authorization too far into this, so that it's kind of identity so that you can make authorization decisions, but we don't, want to reinvent authorization inside this work. And then we talked through kind of some of the use cases. So it was kind of like let's try and define the problem sort of a meeting. So I went through some of the examples. So in that kind of design discussion doc I shared, I talked through some of those ones, like there was an enterprise one, a multi-cloud one, a vault secrets kind of one. And there's a big list in the doc anyway. A like multiple privilege level kind of one where different containers need different identities from pod identities. And someone also brought up an interesting one that we added that was, how does Helm and Tiller, that there's kind of some specialness around how that works for kind of being able to assert other identities as it's creating things. That's kind of interesting. And what else do we talk about? So I think that's mostly what we got to, and we settled on there's another doodle for creating a regular discussion. We went a little bit down the path of do we what do we do about service accounts, and is plugging identity, is like multiple identity providers for a service account the right place to plug things in, or do we want these like external identity exchanges? And there was a little bit of discussion on that, and we basically tabled that and said we'd kind of try and figure out or at least discuss that at the next meeting. So I think that was most of where we got to in that first meeting. But yeah, I think the next meeting will be along the lines of where we know we want pluggable identities. Where should we plug them in? Is kind of one of the very open questions.
So, quick question, Greg. How much of the discussion was about identities in Kubernetes versus sort of identities that stretch outside of Kubernetes?
It was, I think, so in the doc that I wrote, I sort of presented two parts to this. There was like, there's some problems with how we're using JOTs for service accounts, and maybe we can use certificates instead. And then there's like, we need external identities for things like Vault and cloud providers and enterprise who want to use Kerberos and that kind of stuff. And most of the conversation was on the latter, so the external identities bit. I think like the certificate as a replacement for service account thing is sort of related, but also quite separable from external identities.
A lot of it was talking about the types of external identities and wanting to make sure that whatever we end up with enables integrating those types of things without like tying Kubernetes to one specifically. So enabling Istio and Spiffy and Kerberos and cloud providers that have existing mechanisms for Google service accounts or Amazon service accounts. They all have existing mechanisms. We don't want to reinvent those. We want to enable those to deliver credentials or identity into containers.
All right, very cool. Well, I'll find that doodle, and I definitely want to try and attend future meetings. So thanks for the summary.
Yep, and I would recommend people join the mailing list. We're trying to. There's a lot of people from a lot of different SIGs, so I mean, we'll make reports back here, but a lot of the discussion is going to be going on in that list. So if you're interested, definitely join there.
Yeah, and I think one of the early goals should be to like settle on use cases too. So like at least we have kind of what we think are mostly representative cases. And there's a bunch in that doc, and we put a call out for any others that aren't represented yet.
I think there's a page in the community for the working group now that actually pulls together all the info.
Cool.
You got this in there, so I'll put that in the chat. That has the meeting and the mailing list and everything.
The Tiller conversation reminded me that I actually presented to or talked to SIG apps about RBAC and charts work. So this is part of the RBAC to V1 is that we want to get more of the standard charts to work on RBAC enabled clusters. The Tiller confused deputy type of problems did come up in that conversation. I think that has a less clear outcome, but the large item that was discussed was how to move more of the charts over. There's apparently a lot of work that's being done sort of separately, and there's conversations about stuff like the standard charts repo. So more of that to come, and we sort of gather more of SIG apps and figure out who's working on what.
I think it'd also be worth, Tim, if you want to maybe shoot the auto generation tool document out to them as well, because like that's the use case, right? You've got an app that's doing stuff, and now you need to lock it down. And having a tool that would make that easier is going to be really important. So I think SIG apps would be interested as well.
Sure, we'll do.
Eric, do you have? I'm sort of interested in this broken Helm charts thing, like with RBAC. Do you have like some representative ones that are causing problems that you could like list off? Or?
So it's not that they're causing problems; it's that some of them don't have RBAC policies. I don't know if.
Okay, right.
It's kind of the assume that you have all permissions approach. And when you deploy onto a cluster where you don't have all permissions, if the person doing the deployment isn't the one who wrote the app, they're kind of at a loss. It's like, well, what level of permission does this need? Can I give it edit within a namespace? Do I have to give it admin? Do I have to give it cluster? Then it's just a guessing game or kind of cat and mouse, like grant the next level of permission and see what breaks. And that we don't want to push that onto every administrator deploying these. So.
Yeah, completely agree. I was just more interested in like digging into an actual example of how this is hard and for my own education mostly.
So I think that there are some discussions about best practices and education. I think that there's some conversations about giving things unique service accounts, or how does somebody who isn't familiar with RBAC, who needs to write a RBAC policy for their chart, even begin to understand what that problem looks like. So there were a lot of things discussed and a lot of people sort of chimed in. So I don't know if we have a concrete, these are the problems that people are hitting, but those are sort of the common themes that we saw. Awesome. Well, if there's no more agenda items, then I vote that we give everybody their 25 minutes back. Is anybody opposed?
No, I just want to say I'm going to push the Sidetail folks to talk spiffy soon. I already slacked Emiliano because I think I would love to get more visibility here.
Hey Joe, I'm actually on the call here.
Oh, you are?
So, yeah, totally. I've been joining. I joined the first SIG container identity working group rather call as well. So we're here.
All right, sounds good. Cool.
Cool. So please do. I know that we've discussed possibly giving a demo in SIG Auth. So if you would like to, and we would love you to, reach out to one of us and we can schedule that.
Yeah, absolutely. We have it. I think there's a meeting on like the 21st or something, a SIG Auth meeting on the 21st that we were hoping to present out. We have a Kubernetes SIG that is SPIFFE specific. So we were hoping to meet with them first and get some things hammered out before presenting to y'all. So right now we're hoping for the 21st, but I'll mail you, or I'll drop a mail on the list when we kind of get a little bit firmer on that, so we know exactly when that'll be.
So it's the next one's the 23rd. I'm just gonna put you on there for provisionally, and then we can discuss it further if that works.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Cool. Well, we'll call it good, and then thanks everybody for attending, and see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you. See y'all.
All right, thanks.